Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Charles Bell. We're going to discuss school discipline, violence, and safety. Welcome, Dr. Bell.
Thank you.
Dr. Bell is a Detroit native, and we're going to be talking a bit about the Detroit schools today. He got his master's in psychology at Michigan State University, Ph.D. at Wayne State University, and he currently teaches criminal justice at Illinois State University. He's published research in many chapters and journals, and today we want to discuss his new book, which is called Suspended: Punishment, Violence, and the Failure of School Safety, that just was published last year. It's a study of Detroit schools. Dr. Bell interviewed 160 students, parents, administrators, and he presents details about what everyday life is like in one public school system. I think that we should probably start, maybe you could give us just a brief glimpse of how Detroit school, you called it the coordinated destruction of a public school system once the state took it over. Maybe you could give us some background to how this happened and what it meant.
Certainly. So in Detroit, approximately 1994, Detroiters are looking at their public schools and they're seeing their schools are in disarray. And the emergence of technology, buildings were decaying, and they're looking at their schools, they need some money. So they get together and they approve a $1.5 billion bond to reinvest in the public school system and create a sort of state-of-the-art education system in Detroit. And this was contested by the state of Michigan. Many school officials did not want Detroiters to be able to spend that money appropriately. So when Detroiters approved the bond... It
was a city bond? So Detroit voters approved the bond?
Voters approved the bond,
okay.
But the state treasury department allows the spending of the actual bond, so they were controlling the spending. And Detroit is a democratic city, of course, and at the time Governor Engler was in charge of governor of Michigan. And there was a contestation at that point. There were city contractors and state contractors, and at the state Senate level, Senate Bill 297, which is Public Act 10, this bill was proposed, and parameters were sort of a state takeover of public schools. In the bill, it says that a state government could take over public schools if there was an academic or a financial emergency. Now, when we look at these sort of academic issues that were plaguing Detroit public schools, those issues were not at the emergency level. The financial issues that are necessary to take over a public school, according to that bill, the school district had $93 million in reserves. So there was no reason...
Plus the bond.
Plus the bond money. So there was no reason for the state to ever get involved in this school district, but they did. And what we see here, and looking at the aftermath, when the state came in and they fired all the board members, took over the schools, and they spent the entire bond money. They spent this money demolishing schools, rebuilding schools at extremely high amounts of money, $130 million to build schools like Cass Tech. And
I taught at Cass Tech, by the way.
Yeah, and when these schools opened, uneven football fields, climate control systems are disarray. The school was in a complete disarray. And when you think about a $130 million school, you would never expect the school to open with problems.
Yeah.
You would never expect those kinds of issues. So Detroiters are looking around. We didn't vote for this. This isn't what we planned. And they're pulling their children out of this particular district because they felt that the state intervened illegally. And the state sort of returned the district. In that sort of Senate Bill 297, Public Act 10, there was a provision in the bill that allowed Detroiters to regain control of the public school system after 5 years of the takeover. When they got control of their school by a voter referendum in 2005, the schools were in essential bankruptcy. There was a $100 million deficit. The school district had lost at least 50,000 students at that point in time. And Detroiters are looking, what happened?
So this creates the conditions for some of the changes in the daily life of the students. I mean, I certainly can see how this wasn't the only problem Detroit had. I mean, Detroit has, I mean, it's one of the largest cities that filed bankruptcy, and
Certainly.
the Ford and GM really pulled back on their production, so you're losing 100,000 well-paying jobs, which kind of has to affect the quality of life for everybody in Detroit. But your book is about the punishment and the violence and the suspensions that happen in the schools. So how does this relate to, well, first the state takeover and then the return once it was bankrupt, returning it to the city? How does this play out when you get down to how are we going to run this particular school system or this particular school? Because the students, ultimately, the way I read your book, ultimately they're the ones that paid the price.
Certainly. And I think in the initial sort of introduction, I'm painting a picture as to what the school conditions look like for these students. Even before we get to the issue of punishment, the students are saying that we're walking into schools, they didn't have books. They didn't have resources. Our teachers are leaving en masse because of the issues that are occurring.
Yeah, I read in your book that you said students were kept in the gym all day because there weren't enough teachers for their classrooms, but counted as attending and get the state money for that particular school, even though there's no instruction.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
No,
yeah.
horrific conditions for children. And children are looking at this and trying to make sense of this. These children are going to school with high aspirations. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a lawyer, a scientist. And can you imagine walking into a chemistry lab and there's no running water? There's no science equipment. You've graduated from high school and you've never written a paper before. These are the kinds of conditions that the students are describing. They're sitting in a Spanish class and the substitute teacher doesn't know Spanish.
As I go through your book and get to another chapter or two, there's a phrase that caught my attention, and I thought you should explain this a little bit. You suggested that schools in Detroit, and I would say Chicago, Baltimore, Cleveland, most of the major schools, are, quote, anti-black institutions. How does that, I mean, how do you make that assessment based upon the interviews, obviously, but how do you get to an assessment that they're actually anti-black institutions?
Certainly. And two things really struck me as I was completing the interviews. So the students, again, are saying that on the surface, schools appear to be these very friendly, organized spaces that when children walk in the door, they're playing, they're running in the hallways are colorful. And what black students in my interviews told me is that not for me. This is not my experience, because the moment I walk into a school, I'm met with metal detectors, guards, law enforcement officers. I'm bearing the full weight of my teachers' low expectations for me. The teachers are telling me that if I can just, get out of high school, I'll be fine, or I'm going to go to prison at some point. They're telling me that they don't have books, they don't have resources, there's lead in the water. And then sort of school suspension emerges as this final sort of insurmountable barrier for them, that their voices are being silenced. So then connecting what they're telling me to the history of public education in this country. I think it's important that we understand that public education in this country was established in 1832, and it was exclusionary.
Yeah.
It largely functioned for whites only. And when African Americans were freed from slavery in 1865, between 1865 and 1954, it was illegal for black children to walk into a school with white children. This was sort of a state-approved policy, a federal-approved policies. And even after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 desegregated public schools, this was contested. This was not like an immediate sort of entrance.
Oh, this is the law, we're going to follow
Exactly.
the law. There were other obstacles that were
There
put
were many obstacles, and for a number of years, even decades in some places.
Yeah.
In the Detroit area, 1970 is when a lot of black children gained access to the Pontiac public school system, and understanding that school has always sort of been a very racially hostile environment. As I said before, 1970s, when black children gained access to the public schools, the first publication that documents the school-to-prison pipeline, or that black students are being suspended at high numbers, is published in 1974 by the Children's Defense Fund. So you can't ignore that history. That history is there. And then the current history and the current sort of events that students are experiencing, children are looking at this and they're saying, across the road, those students have resources.
Yeah.
We don't.
Yeah.
The only difference that they see is their skin color.
Yeah, and that's not surprising as you lay out the history. that was a condition. But again, I don't know if it's ironic or just completely unacceptable that after you have the desegregation federal legislation and the success of the civil rights movement desegregating schools in major cities, we still are now at the stage where in Chicago and Detroit, obviously, and other big cities, we have more segregation than we had in the mid-'60s. Exactly. I mean, so it's been, and it's not legal to have segregation, but you have segregation kind of from the housing structures, from the resources that are available for the public schools. I mean, Detroit's probably the most extreme example of that. But so if we move on and we talk about some of the practices that were adopted in the schools by administrators, teachers, I don't know how much the state was involved in this, but the school board that I was on for a while entertained the idea of having a zero tolerance policy, and the school board, we pretty much dismissed that because it was extreme. But that kind of sets up the stage for, we're not going to allow this behavior, however you're defining that behavior, in our school, and we'll make it safe and comfortable and a good learning environment for the students that don't misbehave in whatever way it's being defined. So how does this play out when we come to anti-black institutions as a structured policy? How does this play out?
So zero tolerance policies were introduced into public schools via the 1994 Gun-Free Schools Act that Bill Clinton signed, or President Bill Clinton. And the problem here, we would approve of a Gun-Free Schools Act, but what we would not approve of the state sort of taking that provision and that policy and expanding it to dress code violations, disrespect, loitering.
Is it like the broken windows policy in New York City?
I would say it's actually worse.
Okay.
I think it's worse because you're criminalizing things that should never be criminalized. You're criminalizing social problems like poverty, for example. And I can give you an example of this. A young man in the book was struggling financially. His mother purchased uniforms, and he grew out of them. He's coming to school every day. He's catching the bus, showing up at school, and the school is sending him home. They're suspending him for this. So why are we criminalizing students who are poor, who are just showing up to school with whatever clothes they have?
Maybe you could talk more about these, the specifics of some of the suspensions, because in the interviews, some of the students said, if I wear dreads, if I'm listening to a particular kind of music, if I'm too high fashion, if I'm hanging out with a particular group, they said, I'm targeted. So what does that mean when it comes to school discipline or school punishment? The criminality enters into here, I guess.
Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of the students, I noticed that they had several suspensions, and that was really shocking to me. When I was initially conducting the study, I expected students to have maybe between 1 and 5 suspensions, and the students that I were interviewing, they had 20 suspensions, 30 suspensions. And
that could take, I mean, even if you have a 5-day suspension, what we're talking about, 150 days out of the school year, you're almost half the school year.
Yeah.
And sometimes, as the book said, you had more than 5 days, you could have a long time. I'm sorry again.
Oh, no problem. I mean, the students, they're telling me this, and they're giving me this sort of indication that I don't feel comfortable in school. So when I asked them about, do you feel that you're being targeted? Yes, overwhelmingly. And the things that they're being targeted by, their hair, their dress code, their physical appearance, their friends that they hang around. I had students tell me that from the moment they stepped into the school, because their siblings had gone to that school, they were targeted based on their last name.
Yeah.
And it made school seem like a very hostile environment for them. A lot of students just felt like they engaged in skipping class. They avoided certain teachers who they felt were issuing suspensions because of these things. I mean, think about being criminalized because of the natural hair that's growing out of your head. I mean, what can you do about that? Yeah. You're criminalizing elements of me that I can't control, and students are literally opting out of school because of this.
So whether you're suspended or whether you're opting out, either way, you're not in school, you're not learning. One of the things that struck me, I think it was one of the parents said this, is the school is a pipeline to prison because of the suspensions, because of the skipping of school, because it was an unwelcoming environment. So, and I don't remember if you've provided some statistics for that the number of people that are suspended and what their life chances are, but you indicated that.
Certainly. And one suspension increases the likelihood that you'll drop out. And that's just one.
Mm-hmm.
The students that I interviewed had 10, 20, 30 suspensions. Just think about the compounding effects of that, how much school these students are missing. Even the students who really wanted to be in school, after the first suspension or two, you're off task. You don't know what's going on in the school.
Well, talk about that for a minute, because one of the things that was pointed out is I get suspended, but because there aren't enough books, I can't take a book home. Or even if I have a book, the teacher doesn't necessarily tell me what my assignments are. So I can come back, but I've missed all this work, so I'm already behind. If it's math or something like that, there's no way that you're going to catch up. So it's not just that one individual suspension. It's accumulation of being, pushed out of the opportunity to be educated. So.
And I think what was really interesting to me is that research continuously shows that school suspensions have a harmful impact on academic achievement, but how that process unfolds, there's not a lot of research there. So when I started talking to students, they told me that their grades decline because they missed high point value assignments. You know, you're missing an exam or a quiz, and their grades decline sharply because of that. They're missing assignments, and their parents cannot compensate for that missed instruction. Can you imagine being a parent? You're working 10 days, you get a 10-day suspension, and you're working full-time throughout this entire process. You don't know what their curriculum is. You can't just jump in and pretend that you're the teacher. But overwhelmingly, the students told me their grades decline because the teachers refused to give the students their makeup work, used their discretion to deny students access to their makeup work, and they labeled students who received these suspensions as deviant and used excuses like, you don't want to go to school, you're not really interested, you don't want to be here, and used that to deny students access to their work.
The other thing, I thought you had an interesting section because there's this question of identity politics and intersectionality, and I appreciated the way that you approached it because you point out that race, gender, social class, I would argue youth, you put these things in to this mix of a anti-black institution. It's accented by the gender, it's accented by the youth, it's accented by the social class, the resources of the parents or the community in which you live. In fact, you made the observation there that black girls are receiving suspensions at exceedingly high rates. The fastest rising, I think you said the fastest rising suspensions of any demographic in the school system.
Yes.
And why black girls?
And that's the key here. I think it's important to understand that both black boys and girls are being suspended at high rates, but for very different reasons. And I think this notion that black girls constitute a threat, and they're using that sort of excuse to remove them from school. Also, hair issues were recurrent themes in my research. But I think what was really interesting is even in Sandra's case, a young lady that I interviewed who was trying to de-escalate a fight between two other young ladies.
I remember. Yeah.
And then her principal said that, your warning was a threat, and used that to suspend her for 5 days. And what was really shocking about that case is that the young lady who Sandra had supposedly threatened said that she didn't threaten me. Yeah. Sandra says, I didn't threaten her. Nobody says that they threaten each other, but the principal says, you did it. You have to be punished for it, and we must remove you from the school.
One of the things that you said is that school culture encourages student to student and student to administration or teacher confrontations. How does the student to I mean, I could understand student to administrator, because if the teacher continues to suspend me or won't give me homework, I could see how that could very quickly say, Miss Smith, you're not being fair here, and then.
Certainly. And I think here, just to back up a little bit and explain, I think at the center of this is that students felt unsafe. Mm-hmm. Students are walking into schools, again, with metal detectors, guards, and law enforcement officers, yet when they're bullied, they see no one at their aid. Yeah. They're looking for the teacher, they're looking for the guard, they don't see anybody. And they feel that if I don't fight back and defend myself, I'm gonna get beat up. If I walk away, I get beat up even more. So I'm stuck, I'm trapped here, and I don't know what to do. And I learned that a lot of these students, and this was not sort of isolated to Detroit Public Schools, this was around the entire sort of state of Michigan when I was interviewing students, regardless of the sort of school racial dynamics, the students felt unsafe. Yeah. And the students told me that because they were trapped, they felt that they had to do something extreme to sort of earn a reputation that protected
So nobody's
them.
going to pick on me because they
Exactly.
know they can't get away with picking
And then attacking the teacher who's poking you in the chest or instigating these altercations becomes that thing.
yeah.
So I think the solution is to, we have to have conversations. I think at this point, we've had conversations about school policy and school suspensions between educators, between politicians and researchers. We've excluded parents and students and almost...
Which again is remarkable given the current political context where you're trying to talk about critical race theory and parents should be able to
Exactly.
Previously. One of the things you suggest is your proposals, one of them was to have a public disclosure of suspensions, the reasons and the results, which I think is an admirable thing. I also am familiar with the Black Agenda report. Glenn Ford and others have suggested that what needs to happen is there has to be more community control, participation,
Certainly.
involvement by the parents in the schools, because a lot of these things would disappear, I think, if the parents were more intimately involved in deciding what's the curriculum, what is the policy, what is it. I know this from my own experience on my own school board. That changed the climate, and that changed even how the students felt about going to the schools. I want to come back. I got one thing. I loved your book all the way. Last page, oh no, I don't like this particular thing, and I want to tell you what it was.
Certainly.
I'm in communications, so choices of words really affect me. But you talked about the need to improve school punishment and safety initiatives. And right away, I kind of had a response like this, because I would prefer to say I'd like to improve the school educational climate of learning with control and participation by students. The punishment was the word that raised this response in me, because I think oftentimes we go to punishment, like this is going to solve the problem, right? Parents will punish their kids. It doesn't, statistically, it doesn't change behavior, right? So, and all of this evidence about the suspensions obviously has not solved the problems of disruption in any of the schools. So I just wonder why that choice of word.
Great question. And I think that when I was thinking about what the parents were saying, I interviewed parents and they told me that they felt schools needed some sort of punishment mechanisms. They need guards. And I think this is a sort of conversation, again, why are parents being excluded from this conversation to begin with? But parents are saying that we need guards. We need some sort of punishment mechanisms. We just want them to be fairly applied. We want them to be evenly applied. Students should be punished because of dress code issues and minor violations. But also, when you have a school shooting, I had to really think about that. We don't want a school that doesn't have a sort of disciplinary system.
Response to a shooting, absolutely.
To that. And I think that's a really serious issue. Schools are a representation of our larger society. They have their own sort of governance. And in the larger society, we have punishment. Punishment is a part of every institution, and I don't think schools should be excluded for that. And I don't think the students believe that either. I think the students are saying that we want the rules to be applied fairly.
I often think that the parents are excluded from schools, partly because their other tasks, their jobs, their other responsibilities. But it would strike me that part of the way is to enable parent participation, parent involvement. That could be school boards at a different time of day, parental meetings that could happen with teachers or administrators during the day, involving the parents in some of the activities even in the school. I mean, you must know that the PTA and the PTO will have parents come in and talk about their day, and it just strikes me that this is a very insular, I would even say violence-prone society. When you think about the response of police, when I think about most of the big movies, the superhero movies, the solution is always the superhero has to be violent to save the day. It creates a culture, so it's understandable why students think punishment is the first thing, because some schools, and I'm not sure how successful they've been, have talked about restorative justice, where if there's a conflict, rather than punishing one of the students, they're taken away and there's some arbiter and They discuss this and what is a reasonable response that you want from the person that beat you. I don't know if that enters into this conversation at all or not. So
Yes, and it certainly does. I think restorative justice it's appropriate in many ways. However, I don't think restorative justice is the complete solution. I'll take dress code for an example. This young man who is struggling financially, he comes to school in the clothes that he has. If we're going to meet with him and talk about the solution, then who is to blame?
yeah.
Restorative justice, many practitioners would blame that student for coming to school out of dress code. You need to buy clothes. And that is just not reasonable for a lot of kids. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Dr. Bell. We could have a conversation that continues. I would encourage everybody to pick up your book called Suspended, published 2021, but that's all the time we have. Thank you, Dr. Charles Bell, for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.